What if the first machines were not made for work, but for wonder? Not to build, but to move, to sing, to speak, to mimic life itself. Across deserts, beneath oceans, buried in temples, and sealed behind walls older than empires, fragments have been found. Machines from before the age of machines. Devices that should not exist, not with the materials available, not with the knowledge we thought they had, but they do. How did an ancient shipwreck yield a bronze computer that could chart eclipses with mathematical precision? Who designed temple doors that opened on their own, triggered by fire and breath? Why do royal archives speak of birds that sang without lungs, fountains that danced to unseen rhythms, and statues that poured wine with human grace? In dusty archives, engineers described mechanisms we still struggle to recreate. Automata that learned, clocks that performed, machines that could anticipate, but no one knows who first built them, or why so many were hidden, then forgotten. Some believe they were offerings to the divine, others blueprints for knowledge lost in war and flame. A few think they were warnings. This is not science fiction. It is a journey into the lost history of intelligence built from gears and brass, the roots of artificial life, long before electricity ever sparked. And in the silence they left behind, the machines are still whispering, if you know how to listen. The sea was calm when we arrived at the wreck site, just off the Greek island of Antikythera. Our vessel swayed gently in the current. Below, the seabed held secrets not even the stars could predict. As the divers surfaced one by one, their eyes told the story before their mouths could form the words. In their hands was a lump of corroded bronze, jagged, layered, partially fused with time itself. At first it looked like nothing more than debris from a forgotten cargo hold, but as I turned it in my gloved hands, I saw the precision of its teeth. Not jagged chaos, but gears, dozens of them, aligned with purpose. Here, on the bottom of the Aegean Sea, lay a machine from over 2,000 years ago that could chart the movements of the heavens. We now call it the Antikythera Mechanism, a name too clinical for something so haunting. Historians believe it was crafted sometime between 100 and 200 years before the birth of Christ. It was older than most libraries, older than ink on parchment in many parts of the world. And yet it could calculate the positions of the sun, the moon, and possibly even the planets with astonishing precision. The fragments revealed over 30 bronze gears, intricately cut, interlocked in an architecture that mirrored the very structure of time itself. Scholars say it predicted eclipses, phases of the moon, even the timing of ancient Olympic Games. As I stood before its X-ray scans, the gears lit up like constellations in a night sky. This was not just engineering, this was philosophy in motion. What stunned me most was its layered function. This was not a clock. It was not a toy, it was a mechanical cosmos. One dial tracked the Egyptian calendar, another followed the lunar month, and a complex spiral predicted solar and lunar eclipses using what we now call the Saros cycle, a feat of astronomical understanding that most believed was unknown to the ancient Greeks. And yet, here it was, ticking in silence beneath the waves for 2 millennia. But then came the questions. Who built it? Some credit the school of Archimedes. Others say it must have been made in Rhodes, a hub of Hellenistic learning. But no workshop has ever been found. No duplicate, no notes, no blueprints. It was not a mass-produced object. It was singular, as if the knowledge to create it was passed down in whispers, then lost in a single moment. And what truly unsettles the modern scholar is this. If this was made in the 2nd century BCE, then what other machines were made before it, or alongside it? Was this the pinnacle of ancient mechanics, or just a surviving shadow of a much broader tradition? I imagined the hands that turned its dials. A sailor? A philosopher? A priest watching the heavens? And I wondered, did they know they were holding one of the most sophisticated devices that would exist until the Renaissance? Or did they take it for granted, just another tool for divining the path of the cosmos? The Antikythera Mechanism is now housed in Athens behind glass and climate control, but in my memory, it still rests in the silt, surrounded by amphorae, statues, and shipwrecked timbers. It breathes there, quietly. There are whispers of similar devices found in obscure texts, vague references, rumors, but no physical proof has yet emerged. As I walked away from the museum display, I felt no closer to understanding who built it or why its knowledge was buried. Only this remained clear. The ancient world was far more advanced, far more curious than we often allow ourselves to believe. And just as the stars repeat their paths across the sky, so too do the mysteries return. Because not far from where the Antikythera Mechanism was raised, another wreck is being surveyed. Another sunken silence may hold another machine. The expedition continues. The scent of old incense still lingered in the air when I stepped into the ruins of the temple. Columns loomed like petrified trees, their surfaces etched with symbols worn smooth by time and sand. The city around me was long gone. Alexandria, that jewel of intellect and empire, had crumbled into dust and whispers. But inside these sacred walls, I could still hear something, a sound beneath sound, like water moving behind stone. I moved slowly, tracing the mosaic floor with my fingers. Beneath my feet were channels, not for drainage, not for ceremony. They formed deliberate, hidden paths, routes for water, for air, for unseen motion. The temple once astonished visitors. They called it miraculous, doors that opened by themselves, statues that poured libations, voices that whispered from empty rooms. They believed it was divine, but the gods had engineers. At the heart of it all was a man named Hero of Alexandria, a thinker, an inventor, a conjurer of devices that blurred the line between magic and mechanics. His writings describe machines that modern engineers still struggle to explain, not in theory, but in function, because he made water flow like logic. He made fire and steam serve intention. His devices were not prototypes, they worked. I found remnants of his designs embedded in the walls, a pivoting altar, counterweights, and siphons. One mechanism, he wrote, could open a set of temple doors when a fire was lit on the altar. The heat would warm the air in a sealed chamber, increase pressure, push water into a vessel, and shift a weight that pulled the doors open. It was not faith. It was fluid dynamics, and it happened every day in front of worshippers who saw only the divine. Further in, I found a basin that once brimmed with holy water. Beneath it, valves and siphons. Hero described a self-fulfilling vessel, one that never appeared empty, using the principles of the float valve centuries before the flush toilet. And next to it, outlines of what may have been his singing birds. Devices powered by hidden air pressure, emitting sounds as visitors walked past, activated by weight-sensitive floors. The sheer elegance of the design stunned me. These were not crude tricks. These were systems, thoughtfully built, beautifully executed. And all of it hidden behind stone and ritual. I felt a thrill run through me. This was performance. But it was also science. a controlled illusion rooted in physical law. Every effect was an echo of cause, and every cause hidden within the architecture. Yet what haunts me is this. Hero documented many of his inventions. His writings survived, barely through translations and copies. But what of the others who built such wonders? What of the artisans who understood the weight of water and the breath of fire? Their names are gone, their designs vanished. No full device has been found intact, only hints, only clues. How many temples held such secrets? How many engineers worked in shadow, creating sacred motion that looked like miracles? And what happened to their tools, their blueprints, their apprentices? Did the knowledge simply evaporate? Or was it hidden, suppressed, forgotten, left to decay beneath marble and myth? As I stepped outside into the dry Egyptian sun, I looked back at the stone threshold. Once, thousands gathered here to watch stone gods move and speak. They believed the divine touched the world. They were not entirely wrong. It did. But through the minds of those who understood how to channel steam, how to pressure air, how to coax water into dance. There is a chamber not far from here, recently unearthed. Its floor tilts slightly, unnaturally. The workers say they heard a whispering sound when they broke the seal, like breath escaping. I have my tools, my notes, and I will return, because beneath the broken columns and sand lies another temple, and within it, perhaps another contraption, still waiting to move. The gate creaked as I pushed it open. Iron twisted into vines, its hinges long, stiff from rain and time. Beyond it lay the ruins of a royal garden, once the pride of a dynasty. Now it slept beneath layers of soil and silence. Ivy curled through shattered marble. Statues leaned where they once stood tall. And yet something here still moved, not with the wind, but with purpose. I walked through what remained of the garden paths. Pebbles cracked underfoot. The scent of lavender still clung faintly in the earth. And then I saw it perched on a pedestal at the edge of a dry fountain. A bird. Not real, not anymore. It was fashioned of brass, delicate and sharp, wings tucked neatly by its side. It had not flown for centuries, and yet it still held its posture with pride. At first I thought it decorative, a noble curiosity, but as I examined its base, I found a winding key, corroded but intact. I turned it gently. There was resistance, then a soft click. The bird twitched, its head tilted. The wings fluttered once, twice. A faint whistle escaped from within its throat, like wind through an ancient flute. And then it was still again. This was no idle sculpture. This was a machine, a fragment of forgotten motion, one among many according to the records of visitors from long ago. They spoke of gardens filled with singing birds, mechanical musicians, fountains that danced with music and time. These were not myths, they were real. Automata designed for kings by artisans whose names no longer echo in our histories. In the days of the Abbasid caliphs and even before, in Byzantine courts and perhaps earlier still, royal engineers created marvels that blurred the boundary between life and mechanism. The famed engineer Al-Jazari, centuries later, described peacocks that served drinks and boatmen who played flutes, devices built to astonish, to inspire awe. But the mechanisms I found here predated him. The sophistication suggested something older, something deeper. The garden itself had once been part of a pleasure palace, a space where guests walked among artificial marvels, unaware that beneath their feet a network of hidden gears and pulleys worked in silence. Some birds were powered by water pressure, others by carefully coiled springs, each mechanism calibrated to mimic life in the most elegant ways. This was not entertainment, it was engineering wrapped in theater. I crouched near a crumbled statue and found more. Fragments of small gears, rods, and bellows buried beneath leaves and soil. The components were hand-cut, their teeth precise. Even now, they had not rusted entirely. Whoever built them understood material, temperature, friction. They were not guessing. They were calculating. And yet, no records remained of the builders. No plans, no tools, only these traces. Machines built for spectacle, then lost to time and conquest. I could only wonder what other devices once hid in this garden, what melodies played here, what astonished gasps were once drawn from noble lips. As night fell, the garden took on a different voice. Crickets replaced the missing mechanical birds. Moonlight glinted on the brass feathers. The silence felt charged, not empty, but waiting. As if the garden itself remembered what it had once been. A place where the boundary between the natural and the mechanical blurred, where kings walked among artificial life. And just before I left, I heard something, a soft, rhythmic ticking deep beneath the stone basin of the fountain. Faint, intermittent, like a heartbeat that had never quite stopped. I marked the spot. Tomorrow I will return with tools, with light, with patience. Something down there still moves, still waits, and I intend to find it. The first thing I noticed was the sound. Beneath the cracked mosaic tiles and scorched columns, there was a murmur. Subtle, continuous, like breath escaping through stone. I followed it down a corridor where walls leaned with age, where the air was thick with limestone dust and memory. The deeper I moved into the ruins, the louder the sound became. Not a voice, but the movement of something once alive. This place had once been a sanctuary, perhaps a palace, perhaps a temple. No clear sign remained to tell its story. But in the bowels of the structure I discovered something impossible. The chamber sealed for centuries, hidden behind a false wall coated in soot and ash. When I forced it open, I expected bones or scrolls. Instead, I found a system, pipes, vessels, levers, a heart of metal buried in stone. At the center stood a figure carved from obsidian, its mouth parted as if mid-breath. It was flanked by copper tubing, now green with corrosion. Above it, a canopy held two hollow spheres suspended on delicate chains. I brushed away centuries of grime and saw that one sphere had small holes carved at precise angles. Hero of Alexandria once described such a device, a vessel that spun as steam escaped, a primitive engine centuries ahead of its time. The locals believed this was magic, a divine chamber where voices answered unspoken prayers. But the reality was more extraordinary than the myth. The chamber harnessed air pressure, flowing water, and heat to create motion. A fire lit beneath a sealed vessel would build pressure, forcing water through the hidden pipes. The fluid movement activated weights, turned gears, shifted statues. The machine breathed with the elements. Water and air were not fuel. They were life. I stepped carefully around the perimeter. A section of the wall had been blackened by fire, perhaps ritual, perhaps accident. Embedded in the stone was a bellows system connected to a small aperture in the floor. I traced its path downward to a cistern still damp with moisture. The engineering was deliberate. The room was designed to awaken when specific elements aligned. Fire to heat, water to pressure, air to sound. A machine built not to labor but to evoke wonder. There were inscriptions too, faint, weathered, etched in a tongue I had seen only once before, in another ruin hundreds of miles away. They marked cycles, not just lunar or solar, but mechanical. A calendar for maintenance, a rhythm for breath. The builders were not just engineers, they were choreographers of elements, conductors of invisible forces. I reached toward a lever. It resisted. Then with a groan, it shifted. Deep beneath the floor, I heard something stir. A rush, a hiss, then silence. The system was not dead, only dormant. I sat in the chamber's quiet and felt its breath move again. Faint, but real. These were not toys, not illusions. They were experiments in animating the inanimate. Machines that mimicked life, statues that moved with breath not their own, water that obeyed commands, air that became voice. What haunted me most was not how they built it, but why we forgot. How did this understanding vanish? What chain of silence fell between their last breath and our first rediscovery? And how many other chambers like this one lie beneath sand and ruin, waiting to exhale once more? Just before I left, I touched the obsidian figure again. Its mouth still open, its hollow chest still echoing. I whispered a question into the dark. The hiss of air responded. And now I head north, where legends speak of a mirror that sees without light, another temple, another forgotten breath. The door to the archive stuck in its frame as if reluctant to open. Dust poured from the edges when I forced it loose, the air inside thick with age. It had been sealed for centuries, forgotten perhaps deliberately, but the scrolls within had survived barely. I stepped into the gloom, torchlight flickering across parchment, broken tablets, and fragments of copper gears. Something had been left behind, not by accident, but as though in waiting. The Banu Musa brothers, 3 scholars from the 9th century, names that echo through the golden age of Islamic science. Their book, The Book of Ingenious Devices, is a blueprint of wonders. Inside its pages are machines that refill themselves, fountains that change pattern, vessels that know when to open and close. Pages filled with diagrams of valves and gears, of logic made into motion. But the deeper I read, the more questions surfaced. Many devices were described in perfect mechanical detail, but when I tried to reconstruct one, something always felt missing. Not technically, emotionally, as if the mechanism itself relied on an unseen hand, a decision point, a layer of control that was never explicitly drawn. That is when I found it. A marginal note, handwritten in fading ink, not part of the original manuscript. It referred to the hidden hand, not divine, but human, a guiding force behind the machines. I began to see the patterns. These were not just devices, they were behaviors, machines that responded, reacted, anticipated. I turned my focus to one particular device, a mechanical servant, a basin that filled with water and, when lifted, triggered a bird call from across the room. The connection made no sense until I noticed the balance of weights and pulleys described in the text. When the vessel moved, it shifted a counterweight hidden beneath the floor, which activated a bellows. It was not just cause and effect, it was input and output, a decision triggered by action. What I was seeing was programming, not code as we understand it, but logic, sequence, instruction. An invisible programmer embedded their thinking into the metal and wood, anticipating choices, creating response. These machines were not passive, they were prepared. And yet, no name ever appears as the designer. The Banu Musa were compilers, recorders. translators of knowledge gathered from earlier sources, perhaps Greek, perhaps Persian, perhaps something now entirely lost. The original mind, the true architect, is absent from history, a ghost behind the gears. As I walked the archive, I saw their echoes everywhere. Devices never built, only imagined, diagrams half-finished, machines with intentional mystery. One page showed a fountain that changed shape every hour, but the mechanism was never revealed, as if only those who had seen it firsthand could recreate it. Knowledge passed in person, never written. A tradition kept alive through speech and demonstration, then silenced. We think of ancient machines as primitive, toys, but these were not toys. These were thought experiments made real. Logic systems expressed in metal and water, fire and air, an early attempt at automation, at interactivity, at agency, not merely to move, but to respond. Before I left, I copied one final page. The ink nearly faded. A device that poured wine only when 3 specific levers were turned in the right order. If done incorrectly, nothing would happen. It was a lock, a combination, a puzzle that required intent. The invisible programmer knew what they were doing. They understood human behavior and embedded it into machines. What else did they encode? What other systems lie sleeping in forgotten libraries, waiting to be deciphered? Tomorrow I head east, where ruins cling to the edge of a dried-up lake. Locals say a machine still stands there, silent, watching, and I will be ready to listen. The courtyard was silent when I arrived. Sunlight filtered through arched windows, illuminating dust that danced in the still air. In the center stood a massive figure, an elephant, carved not from ivory or stone, but constructed from layers of wood, bronze, and painted panels. Its eyes were set with dark stones. Its pose was regal, but motionless. Yet I knew this creature had once moved with music. They called it the elephant clock, an automaton, a marvel of medieval engineering, built by the legendary polymath Al-Jazari in the 13th century. But it was more than a timekeeper. It was a theater of precision, a machine designed to mark hours not with ticks, but with spectacle, with sound, with story. I circled the platform where it rested. At its sides, windows framed small musicians. One held a cymbal, another a drum. Above them sat a scribe, perched on a canopy. Beside him, 2 falcons, each figure a character, each one with a role to play. When the clock functioned, water would drip from a concealed reservoir, slowly shifting afloat inside a vessel. When the float reached its limit, it triggered a series of levers. The falcons would lean forward, the cymbals would clash, the drummer would strike, and the elephant would announce the hour, not with cold precision, but with performance. Al-Jazari's design was not born in isolation. It drew from centuries of mechanical knowledge across the ancient world. Greek pneumatics, Persian water clocks, Chinese escapements. But what he created here was something new, a convergence of art, science, and storytelling. The elephant was not just a machine, it was a symbol of knowledge crossing borders, of harmony between cultures. The structure itself bore influence from India in the form of the elephant. The water system hinted at Greek hydraulics. The figures reflected Islamic art and mathematics, and the mechanics within pure ingenuity. It was multicultural philosophy turned into motion, a moving celebration of the human intellect. As I examined the inner chamber, now exposed through centuries of decay, I saw the gearwork still in place, fragile but intact, cams carved by hand, axles resting in sockets lined with oiled wood. The tubing that carried water had long dried, but traces of mineral deposits told me the path it once flowed. I could almost hear it, the drip, the shift, the strike. There was more. In one corner of the room covered in cloth, I found a partial reconstruction, modern hands attempting to resurrect the design. But they had stopped halfway. A note explained, inconsistent intervals, mechanism unclear. Even with all our digital models and simulations, we still struggle to recreate what Al-Jazari understood by intuition and practice. This clock was not programmed in code, but in patience. It required calibration, balance, timing, and when it worked, it did so with elegance. A clock that made time feel like music, that turned hours into theater. What stayed with me most was the intent. Al-Jazari did not build this just to measure hours. He built it to inspire wonder. He believed that even a machine should be beautiful, that function should serve joy, and that the measure of time could be something more than utility, it could be experience. As I packed my tools, I paused one last time before the elephant. Its eyes, still gleaming, caught the last light of day. I imagined the moment centuries ago when a child first watched it come to life, when the falcons bowed, when the cymbals rang out, and time itself became a story. There is a manuscript nearby, said to hold notes never included in Al-Jazari's official records, devices too ambitious, too strange. I leave tonight to find it. Because if the elephant sang, what else did he build that still waits to be heard? The ballroom was empty when I entered. A great vaulted space, long abandoned to silence. Dust coated the marble tiles like frost. Faded frescoes watched from the walls, their painted faces cracked and quiet. Once, this hall had hosted royalty. Laughter, music, applause. But now it held only echoes and something else. At the far end of the room, under a veil of cobwebs, stood a glass case. Its surface was fogged with age. The lock had rusted shut. I pried it open, and there she was, the Marionette, life-sized, dressed in a faded gown of woven silk and gold thread. Her arms jointed, her fingers slender, her eyes painted with unsettling care. It was not a doll, it was a performer. A winding key protruded from a hidden panel in the pedestal below. I turned it slowly, felt the gears tighten, then paused. Nothing. For a moment, I thought the mechanism was broken, until she moved. Her head tilted, her hand lifted. One delicate step forward, then another. Her arms flowed in rhythm. She raised an invisible harp and plucked the air, each movement smooth, controlled, elegant, as though she remembered choreography taught long ago. I stood frozen, not out of fear, but awe. This was not play. This was theater embedded in brass and silk. Marionettes have existed for centuries, puppets moved by string, by hand. But this was different. The control was inside her, a sequence of gears, cams, and springs hidden within her base dictated each gesture. She was not being guided. She was performing from memory, mechanical memory, encoded in motion. Records from the court speak of her appearances during royal ceremonies. The nobles would watch in wonder as she danced, bowed, gestured in time with music. She was introduced not as a machine, but as a gift from the court's master engineer. A marvel created for beauty, not function. Yet behind that beauty was astonishing complexity. I opened the base. Inside, dozens of gears meshed with precision, each cam sculpted to create a specific motion. The system had been repaired many times, Scratched initials from different craftsmen marked the wood. This was a collaborative legacy, passed down, protected, perfected, but the original designer, unknown. What drove someone to build her? Was it to entertain, to impress, or was it a deeper obsession? The desire to capture grace, to preserve it, to make it repeat forever in brass and silk. Her dance did not falter. Her timing was flawless. Every gesture had intent. But what haunted me most was her face. Unlike the cold neutrality of most automata, this marionette had expression, not exaggerated, just enough to feel almost real. She smiled gently, as if she knew she was being watched, or remembered what it felt like to be seen. There are rumors of other marionettes, a troupe hidden away after the court fell. Some say they were taken to private collections. Others believe they were buried to keep their secrets from invaders. I found no trace of them here, only this. One, alone, still dancing. As I prepared to leave, I wound her once more, let her perform beneath the broken chandeliers. Her dress shimmered in the dim light. Her hands traced music I could not hear. And I thought, in some way, she had outlived her creators. She had outlasted the court, the kingdom, even the memory of their names. Tonight, I travel to a coastal town where an old shipwright's ledger mentions a wooden figure that could row and sing. Perhaps another marionette. Perhaps something even stranger. And I will follow the trail wherever it leads. The invitation came folded in vellum, sealed in wax, stamped with a sigil I did not recognize. No address, no name. Only a phrase etched in ink so fine it shimmered like oil under light. When the bell tolls thrice, enter. I almost dismissed it as a prank until I noticed the paper was centuries old and smelled faintly of oil and brass. That night, I stood at the edge of a forgotten district in Prague, near a cathedral that had long been left out of the city's walking tours. 3 bells rang in sequence from the tower above, not from the cathedral's spire, but from beneath it. A panel in the old stone gate clicked and swung inward. Inside, the air was warm and scented with candle wax, cedar, and iron. I stepped down a spiral staircase lit by flickering lanterns. The walls narrowed. The hum of gears whispered from behind them. Then, I emerged into a vast underground chamber, and the revels began. Before me danced figures dressed in opulent robes and powdered wigs. Each moved in time with the music. A slow, lilting waltz played on a self-strumming harp, but none of the dancers breathed. Their faces were porcelain, their joints jointed in bronze and brass. Automata. There were dozens of them, perhaps more. Men in gilded coats who bowed and twirled. Women in hoop skirts who glided without effort across polished floors. Their movements were eerie, yet elegant. Too smooth to be human. Too human to be easily dismissed. A massive clock loomed overhead, its hands moving in slow, deliberate rhythm. With each chime, the entire room shifted. Chandeliers dimmed and flickered. A curtain pulled back to reveal a string quartet of mechanical musicians, their bows rising and falling with chilling precision. Every part of this scene was powered by clockwork, water pressure, pulley systems, weighted wheels ticking in rhythm. I stood in awe, but I was not alone. In the corner of the hall, an old man sat watching me. He wore a coat stitched with cogs and keys, and beside him lay a long-forgotten notebook filled with schematics. He introduced himself only as the curator. He did not speak of years, only of cycles. of times when the Automata awakened for a single night to perform their eternal waltz. The origin of the Clockwork Revels, he told me, was lost even to him. Some say it began as an alchemical experiment. Others believe it was a secret performance for emperors and occultists. What is certain is that the entire chamber is a machine, a theater of gears, every movement connected, every note played in perfect coordination. He invited me to stay until the final dance, to watch what no living soul had seen in generations. I did. At the last stroke of midnight, the revelers halted, the music slowed, a final automaton emerged. Unlike the others, it wore no costume. It was bare brass and polished steel, humanoid but austere. It bowed to the chamber, then to me. And then, the entire hall went silent. Lights dimmed, gears slowed. One by one, the dancers returned to their alcoves. The clock struck once more, and I was alone. The curator was gone, as was the notebook. Only a single gear remained on the floor, warm to the touch, as if freshly used. I pocketed it, unsure if what I had seen was real, or a performance engineered so perfectly it had transcended the boundary of illusion. Now I travel to an abandoned villa in Bavaria, a place where, it is said, the walls once moved with the rhythm of a mechanical orchestra, and if the gears still turn, I will be there to listen. The passageway was narrow, too narrow for comfort. Walls of cold stone pressed in on both sides, the air stale and silent. I followed the faintest draft, the kind you only notice when the world around you holds its breath. My torch flickered against ancient bricks, and then caught on something unusual, a seam. It was a vertical line where no line should be, a slit, almost invisible, carved into the mortar. I pressed against it. Nothing happened, but when I leaned into the adjacent wall, a panel clicked behind me. I turned and watched as the seam widened. A hidden door slid inward with a slow groan, revealing darkness beyond. I stepped through. The chamber was circular and at first glance entirely empty, but when my torchlight swept across the walls, the room answered. A soft mechanical chime echoed above me. Then another. One by one, small doors carved flush into the stone began to open. From each portal emerged a figure, carved from wood, brass, and ivory. Miniature kings in robes, warriors with drawn swords, scholars clutching scrolls. They stepped forward in sequence, their gears ticking faintly. Trumpets sounded, bells rang, and the figures bowed or gestured, as though welcoming a guest. It was a performance, but no audience had seen it for centuries. I examined the walls more closely. Behind each door was a mechanism, intricate, deliberate, cams rotated to trigger springs, levers engaged to pull cords, hidden weights reset the figures for another cycle. It was not chaotic, it was orchestrated. I found a rusted plaque embedded in the floor. Its inscription barely legible. Translated, it read, "The Hall of Memory. Only those who listen may learn." I realized then, this room was not for decoration. It was a kind of living archive. Each figure represented a different chapter. A king, a law, a war, a secret. A mechanical record of history, told not through words, but through motion. As I turned the central gear embedded in the pedestal, the entire room shifted. The figures retreated, doors closed, then another set opened. A new scene, a different time. New figures emerged. It was like watching a great book turn its own pages. And yet, I had never read of this place. No maps marked its location. No documents described its machines. The technology resembled elements I had seen before, but it was more refined, more expressive. Someone had spent decades, perhaps generations, perfecting this chamber, encoding history into gears and joints. I wondered who had been meant to see it. Was it a teaching hall for the privileged few? A sacred archive for a vanished order? Or a memorial for events too dangerous to write down? In one corner, I found a locked panel. Behind it, a chamber I could not open. But I heard something behind the wood, a faint ticking, still alive. Whatever it was, it had not stopped. It waited. Before I left, I watched one final sequence. A procession of robed figures bowed to a central figure who held a broken staff. As they turned away, one opened a final door, revealing an empty alcove, an ending, or a beginning. I closed the panel and stepped back through the entrance. The door sealed behind me with a slow, mechanical sigh. The room had returned to stillness, but its story lingered in my mind. Tomorrow, I make my way to a mountainside monastery, where monks once claimed to hear bells ring without touching them. Perhaps another chamber waits, another door hidden behind stone, and I will be listening. The wind outside had picked up. It howled through the canyons of broken rooftops and splintered beams. I found the workshop on the edge of a forgotten village, tucked beneath a crumbling tower that once housed stargazers and clockmakers. The door was half off its hinges. A single rusted hinge groaned as I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Old oil, charred wood, iron dust. Not recent, but still lingering. A place that had not seen hands in generations and yet still held the memory of motion. Workbenches were scattered with tools, some fused to their surfaces by time. Drawings curled at the edges, layered in soot and scribbled revisions. And then there was the machine. It sat alone at the center of the room, a figure barely taller than a child, constructed of brass and steel. Its limbs segmented, hands shaped with delicate precision. A humanoid automaton, half finished, or perhaps long completed and only broken with time. I knelt beside it and turned the winding key embedded in its back. The mechanism resisted, then gave. A soft click, a hum, then movement. Its arm rose, slow and hesitant. It turned at the elbow, fingers splaying like it remembered how. The head tilted slightly, then paused. I waited for it to repeat, but it didn't. Instead, it lowered its hand, turned its head to the side, and stopped completely. That was the first sign. This was no simple mechanical puppet. It wasn't repeating the same motion in perfect loop. It was varying, deliberating, as though its gears remembered more than just motion. I opened the back panel. Inside, the gearbox was unlike any I had seen. Layers of cams, weights, and springs intertwined like a puzzle in motion. But here's what caught my breath. Each gear was marked, scratched with tiny symbols, personal notes, instructions, or perhaps signatures. It had been modified again and again, not by one builder, but many. I could trace the different hands by the age of the brass, the depth of the scratches, the style of the etching. Each builder had added something new, a gear here, a cam there, tweaks that changed how the machine responded. This automaton had evolved. That was when I began to understand. It had no single creator, no final design. It was an inherited experiment, a machine passed down through generations, altered with intent, but without full understanding. Each engineer had left a piece of themselves inside, but none had the whole picture. What had begun as a marvel of motion had become something else, something that learned by layers. And now it moved differently. It raised its hand again, slower this time. The fingers purled. It reached toward me. I did not move. The hand hovered, then dropped back into its lap. There was no rational reason for it to hesitate, no logic for variation in a purely mechanical system, unless it had been designed to incorporate input, to change with its environment, to choose. Was it possible that a sequence of modifications had produced something unintentional, an emergent behavior? A ghost not of spirit, but of countless human touches layered into the same device. Perhaps it was just a trick of the mind. Pareidolia in motion, but as I stood to leave, I heard the softest sound behind me. A creak. Not from the wind, from the floor. I turned back. The automaton had shifted, just slightly. It was watching. Tomorrow, I will travel to a sunken archive, where a scroll is said to describe a machine that could dream. And I need to know if this ghost is just the beginning. The temple stood alone at the edge of the cliff, staring out over a sea that had long since receded. The wind howled through broken archways. Birds circled above in silence. It was the kind of place the locals spoke of only at dusk, when shadows were long and their voices low. They called it the House of the Breathless Voice. I pushed open the heavy door, its hinges groaning with effort. Inside, the air was still. Cold stone walls rose on all sides, carved with symbols both geometric and organic. At the center of the chamber was a figure seated on a throne, life-sized, unmoving, its face covered with a polished bronze mask, featureless except for two hollow eyes. One hand rested on its lap, the other held a mirror, tarnished and cracked. This was the oracle. They say in its prime, people would travel for weeks to hear it speak, that it answered questions whispered into the chamber, delivering prophecies through smoke and motion. The priests claimed it was the breath of the divine made visible. But as I circled the figure, it became clear. This was no priest in disguise. This was a machine. Behind the throne, hidden within the wall, I found the remnants of a complex system. Bellows, pipes, weights, a sealed chamber with soot along the roof. The temple had been built around a mechanism, a voice chamber, a system designed to turn heat and air into speech. I lit a small flame in the fire basin and waited. As the air warmed, a faint hiss echoed through the pipes. The mirror began to tremble slightly in the figure's hand, and then the mask moved. Not much, just enough to tilt to turn a fraction toward me. There was no clear voice, no articulated words, but the sound that came through was unmistakable. A long, drawn exhale, shaped by chambers and pressure. A mechanical whisper that echoed from deep within the walls. It did not form language, but it carried weight, intention, presence. I realized then the oracle had never spoken in words. Its answers had been interpreted by those who heard them. A soft hiss for yes, a sharp click for no. The tone of air made sacred by setting and ritual. The machine was the stage, the priest was the translator. Together, they created prophecy. I examined the bellow system more closely. The mechanism was delicate yet purposeful, designed to draw air in slowly, compress it, and release it through thin reeds and hollow ducts. It could respond to heat, to pressure, even to sound. Some parts were tuned like instruments, others designed for subtle motion. It was not an illusion. It was a programmed performance. What struck me most was not the technology, but the belief it generated. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, had come here seeking answers, and they found them, not because the machine truly spoke, but because they needed it to. In this chamber, mechanics became mysticism, engineering became ritual, and over time the builders were forgotten, replaced by myth. Was it deception? Or something more profound? A collaboration between mind and machine, where meaning was born not from what was said, but from how we chose to listen. As the fire dimmed, the oracle fell silent, the mirror stilled, the mask returned to its original position, the chamber cooled, and the whisper faded into stone. I packed my things, but not my questions, because the further I walk into these ruins, the more I begin to understand. We did not create machines simply to mimic life. We created them to carry meaning, to hold belief, to reflect something back at us. Tomorrow, I head toward the Salt Plains, where a structure half buried in crystal is said to sing when the wind moves through it. Another voice waits, and I am ready to listen. The sand had swallowed it whole. For centuries, the desert winds swept endlessly across this part of the world, covering what once had been a thriving city with a veil of silence. Traders passed through unaware. Pilgrims paused only to refill their water. But beneath the dunes, something waited. And when the earth finally cracked open, after a rare flood exposed an old stone foundation, I followed the fragments into shadow. What I found was not a tomb, not a palace, but a workshop. The stairs led down into cool air, untouched by sunlight for generations. My lantern flickered across stone walls lined with alcoves, each one packed with the rusted remains of tools, scrolls, and strange devices. Gears of bronze the size of my palm, coils of copper tubing, discs marked with constellations. It felt as though I had entered the mind of an inventor, caught mid-thought. And in the center of the chamber, beneath a collapsed wooden beam, lay the machine, or what was left of it, a humanoid form, half buried in sand, its arm outstretched as if reaching for something it had once held, articulated joints, a spine built from interlocked plates, the chest cavity open, revealing a nest of gears, bellows, and broken valves. This was no statue. It had been built to move, perhaps to serve, perhaps to perform. I brushed away the sand from its face and found eyes carved from polished obsidian. Around the room were sketches, pinned to the wall with corroded nails, diagrams of limbs in motion, notes written in a language that borrowed from several scripts, as though the builder had blended traditions. I could make out references to balance, to pressure, to memory. I traced my fingers along the workbench and found a cylinder sealed with wax. Inside, a roll of fine parchment survived. Not a text, but a sequence, a program, encoded in the turning of cams and rods, instructions for movement, an ancient algorithm. And yet, no record of this place exists in any archive. No historian has named this inventor. There are no mentions in royal records, no signs that this workshop ever traded its creations. It was as if it had been erased or hidden. Why? The craftsmanship rivaled anything I had seen in the courts of Baghdad or Constantinople. But this was not made for spectacle. It felt personal, experimental, a sanctuary for ideas too advanced or too dangerous. One of the walls bore a mural, faded but still visible. It showed 3 figures, one human, one mechanical, and one something in between. The central figure held a key in one hand, in the other, a flame. Beneath the image, an inscription read, "That which is built may dream." I sat there for a long time, watching the light shift across the floor. I wondered who had built these machines, who had dreamed of giving motion to the unmoving, and who had buried it all in sand, sealing their legacy beneath time. Before I left, I took only one item, a small gear etched with the same symbol as the key in the mural. It still turned, smooth and clean, as if waiting to be reconnected, as if waiting to move it. Tomorrow, I crossed the basin toward a ruined observatory, where glass lenses were said to follow stars long forgotten by our charts. But tonight, I sleep beside a workshop where the future once tried to take shape. And I wonder if, somewhere in the dark, the machine still dreams. The library was colder than I expected. Beneath layers of marble and dust, deep within a vault that had not been opened in centuries, the air felt preserved, still, untouched by breath. The shelves here were different, narrower, carved from stone, meant to withstand fire and time. Many of the scrolls had crumbled, but a few remained, tightly rolled, sealed in brass tubes with inscriptions too faint to read at first glance. One caught my attention, not for its title, which was missing, but for the weight of the container. It was heavier than the others, balanced, as if it had been made not just to store knowledge, but to protect something delicate. I opened it carefully and unrolled the parchment onto the table. It was not a treatise, not a religious text. It was a blueprint, a single machine, drawn with exceptional clarity. A humanoid figure, life-sized, designed to lift a goblet, tilt it forward, and pour liquid into a waiting cup. The joints were detailed, the center of balance accounted for, the gears drawn with near mathematical precision. This was not concept art, it was instruction. But what struck me most was the signature. In the lower corner, barely visible beneath a flourish of ink, was a name. One I did not recognize. It was not Greek, nor Arabic, nor Latin. It was singular, and no other record of it appears in any archive I have searched. No mention in engineering texts, no school associated with it. Whoever they were, this was the only surviving whisper of their work. I tried to find more. Spent days in the surrounding archives, cross-referencing inventories, marginal notes, fragments of correspondence. Nothing. It was as if the builder had left this one drawing behind and vanished into time. And yet, this machine, it was elegant, perfectly balanced. It used weighted levers and fluid channels to respond to the presence of a cup beneath the goblet. If the cup was not there, the arm would not move. A simple feedback system, a decision based on input, logic expressed in gears, anticipation built into metal. It mirrored the behavior of life. Was it ever built? No known example survives. No remnants, no broken parts, no copies. And that is what unsettled me. I have seen hundreds of machines across continents and centuries. Most are incomplete. Most bear signs of collaboration, repair, replication. But this felt singular, a mind working in silence, designing not for glory, but for understanding. Why was the signature hidden? Why leave behind a creation this refined, only to let it vanish into obscurity? Perhaps it was deliberate, a gift meant for a future mind. Perhaps the builder knew that time forgets names, but remembers ideas. As I traced the lines of the blueprint once more, I felt the presence of that mind, a quiet, confident hand. A designer who believed the language of machines could outlast the fading of empires. And they were right. Because I see echoes of this design in devices that came centuries later. Similar balances, similar movements. as though this invisible engineer had spoken across time, their signature not in ink but in influence. Before I left the library, I made a copy of the design, not for display, for study. It now sits in my field journal beside the original, a reminder that sometimes the greatest minds do not seek recognition. They simply build and let the world catch up. Tomorrow, I travel to a coastal vault where machines were said to have recorded movements of the moon and tides without ever being named. And maybe, just maybe, I will find another mark from the hand that history forgot. The door groaned open with a sigh of forgotten air. Beneath a government museum in a city that rarely acknowledged its own past, I had gained access to a sub-level marked for inventory. Not exhibit, not display, just storage. Boxes piled in disarray, crates nailed shut decades ago, catalog numbers faded, forgotten. But in the farthest corner, past shattered cases and moth-eaten banners, I found a steel door with no label, just a lock so old it had rusted itself into silence. The custodian gave me a glance, a shrug, and a quiet nod. I broke the seal. Inside, the room smelled of dust and machine oil. The light above flickered as I stepped into the archive of lost motions. Row upon row of automata, not displayed, not restored, just paused. They stood like frozen actors on a forgotten stage, figures of dancers, animals, musicians. Some missing limbs, others intact but still. Here was a copper swan, wings half folded. There, a wooden monk with one outstretched hand and no eyes. In the shadows, a child-sized soldier, its joints locked mid-march. They were not posed, they were interrupted. Each one had once moved, once turned, bowed, fluttered, clapped. Machines built not to last forever, but long enough to inspire. And now, they waited in this mausoleum of motion. I knelt beside a small girl carved from maple and brass. Her skirt was weighted, her arms connected to a hidden system of gears. I turned the winding key slowly, not sure what to expect. Nothing. Then, the faintest twitch. A shoulder. A sigh of resistance from a long silent spring. But the movement did not complete. Something inside had seized. Or perhaps, forgotten. I moved to another, a fox made of riveted tin. Its tail curled around a broken music box. I examined the inner mechanics. Simple, efficient, and yet beautifully unnecessary. The tail served no function in the music. It was there for flourish, for grace. That, I realized, was the common thread in this archive. These machines were not tools. They were gestures. They had once danced, mimicked, responded. They were built to move in ways that delighted, that evoked wonder. They did not solve problems. They asked questions. Who made them? Some bore signatures. Most did not. A few had tags written in languages no longer spoken. There were French automata from the 18th century, Persian marvels built for royal courts, Chinese devices that mimicked birdsong. But many were unplaceable, their materials local, but their ideas universal. And all of them had fallen silent. What struck me most was not their stillness, but their posture. Each machine, stopped in mid-gesture, still conveyed the motion it once held, as if the memory of movement clung to them. A bent knee, a tilted head, a hand half raised. They were not dead. They were waiting for hands that remembered how to wind them, for eyes that saw not just metal, but meaning. This was not a junk room. It was a library. A library where the books had no words, only gears. a place where knowledge was encoded in motion, and that knowledge was fading. I marked several for restoration, took measurements, notes, but one in particular stayed with me. A mechanical owl, eyes made of glass, perched atop a rusted globe. When I touched it, the globe spun, just slightly, enough to tell me something inside still lived. Tomorrow, I journey to a cliffside tower where a machine was said to mark eclipses before they appeared in the sky. But tonight, I carry with me the silence of the archive, the echo of dances not danced in centuries, and the promise to awaken one of them. I climbed before dawn. The air was thin on the ridgeline, sharp with the scent of cold stone and distant smoke. Behind me, the valley still slept beneath a low mist, a pale mirror to the centuries that had shrouded what I had come to find. Above, the last stars began to fade, chased by the earliest streaks of light. I reached the summit just as the sun broke the horizon, washing the ruins in gold. Before me stood the remains of a facility. Not a palace, not a temple, but a place of work, of creation. Stone foundations arranged in careful symmetry hinted at walls that had once held heat and light. Tables of slate, now cracked and overgrown with moss. Channels carved into the floor, designed to carry water, or perhaps molten metal. Whatever had been made here was done with purpose, but it was not the place itself that held me still. It was what lay at its center. A structure of copper and bone-white stone, angular, weathered by centuries of sun and rain, yet unmistakably artificial. A cradle of gears and polished lenses aimed at the sky. It was not broken, it was incomplete, abandoned mid-construction, or perhaps simply awaiting its final motion. I stepped closer and saw them. Symbols carved into the plates, not letters, but shapes repeating in fractal patterns, spirals, lattices, mechanisms layered upon metaphors. This was not just a device, it was an idea made physical, a machine dreaming of life. Some say machines are the end of human labor, that they are tools, extensions of our will, our convenience. But what I found here did not feel built for us. It felt like something else, an attempt to cross a line we barely understand, not to serve, but to become, to move with purpose, to calculate not just time or temperature, but thought, decision, desire. And it was ancient, older than most would dare to admit. The materials matched no known catalog. The inscriptions resembled no single language, a blend, a code, a convergence of traditions that suggested collaboration across lands or something hidden from every land. The sun caught the edge of a polished disc still aligned with the morning star. It rotated slightly, not by my hand, by balance, by intention. Something inside still worked, still watched the sky. I sat beside it and waited. Hours passed. The light shifted. The gears hummed softly with thermal expansion, a rhythm barely perceptible. But it was there, alive. Not in the way we define it. No blood, no breath, but in purpose, in response, in design that mimics intention. And I asked myself, if something is built to react, to change, to choose, does it not also live, even if only for a moment? I left no mark, took no piece. Some things are not meant to be claimed. Before I descended, I looked once more across the valley, a place dotted with ruins. With chambers and vaults, libraries and temples, we call them broken, forgotten, but they are not. They are waiting for those who still listen, who still ask, who still wonder what lies beyond the threshold of myth and mechanism. Tomorrow, I will head west, toward the ruins where time was once measured not by sundials but by shadows cast by machines we still cannot name. But I carry this moment with me, this glimpse toward the edge, the horizon of machine life, and the silence that somehow still speaks. Another piece of the puzzle, another secret swallowed by the ages. As I sit beside the last campfire of this expedition, with the wind settling low across the hills and the stars blinking slowly into place, I turn over the fragments in my hands. A gear, a sketch, a worn page, pieces pulled from time's silence, each one a whisper, each one a question. I have seen machines that moved without hands, that danced, that spoke, that waited, built by people whose names are lost, whose voices were never written down, but whose minds they still echo in the hum of bronze, in the tilt of a cam, in the weight of water shifting behind stone. We often imagine history as linear, as progress climbing ever upward, but it is not. It is a tide, rising, receding, carrying away brilliance as often as it delivers it. These machines, these marvels from before the age of circuits and code, show us that we are not the first to dream of giving motion to the still, not the first to craft intelligence from mechanics, not the first to blur the boundary between the living and the made. They remind us that the future is not a straight road. It is a circle, a spiral, a motion we return to again and again. But what still haunts me, what holds me in quiet awe, is the intent behind them. These creations were not made for profit, not for conquest. They were made for wonder, for beauty, for belief. They were made to show that the world could be more than what it appeared to be, and that still matters. Somewhere out there, beneath soil and sea, beneath ash and legend, more machines sleep, waiting, not just to be found, but to be understood, to be heard again. So I keep the journal open, the compass ready, the torch lit, because history does not whisper, it waits, and I intend to answer.